Thank you everyone for being here today for our lecture on the health effects of climate change. This is an overview for policymakers and clinicians. My name is Lori Bruce and I'm the Associate Director of Yale's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. And our center is truly interdisciplinary with study groups and programs, not just in clinical ethics, but ethical policymaking, public health, environmental ethics, animal ethics, ethics of technology, community ethics, racial equity, and so much more. I am also the founder and director of the Department of Policy and Ethics within the International Chair in Bioethics. And this group tends to foster collaboration and community and education to increase ethical policymaking. Our steering committee is truly global and includes physicians and ethicists with interest in global solidarity. And considering our numerous global challenges today, a bolstered call for solidarity may be considered long overdue. Today's event is sponsored by both groups I mentioned, and the second lecture in this series related to mitigating the health effects of climate change, how policymakers and clinicians can plan and respond to the challenges that Dr. Latham will line up for us today, will be on May 5th. So we'd love to see you there. And if you have other interests and other events related to ethical policymaking, we encourage you to sign up for our mailing list at the link that you see. And I would be remiss if I did not mention our Summer Institute is still accepting applications until the end of this month from both students and professionals. We have our 4-week virtual program, which will begin on June 28th. And then we have a bit of space left, I believe, in our 4-day Foundations in Bioethics program, which begins on June 29th. So today's talk is being recorded. It is streamed on our Facebook page. We will have 45 minutes of lecture, followed by 45 minutes or so of discussion and Q&A. The chat is open for you, and if you have questions for us, please use our Q&A. Without further ado, I'm delighted as always to introduce Stephen Latham, the director of our center here at Yale. He is a senior research scientist in political science. He is a lecturer in law, senior lecturer in the School of Environment. He is also a Hastings Center Fellow, and he teaches some of the most popular courses here on campus. So Steve, I will turn it over to you if you would like to share your slides.
Yes, I will do that. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to just flip my slides up onto the screen. There we go. Is all well now? You can see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. I thought I would start out with saying a little bit, lowering expectations a little bit. I'm kind of new at this environment game. I have only recently, because I felt a little bit mission-driven about it, started teaching environmental ethics at our School of the Environment, formerly known as the Forestry School. And I am considerably newer to this field than several of you who I can see are in the audience. So I'm more than slightly intimidated by at least some of you. I also want to acknowledge the importance to me and to my education in this area of a program run by my colleague Bob Dubrow at the School of Public Health. There is a Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, and they run a course which I took on effects of climate change and climate change adaptation strategies and communication about climate change. And I could not possibly try to give this talk without having learned so much, particularly from Bob Dubrow. Fair warning, even though this is a bioethics center and I'm an ethicist and an aspiring environmental ethicist, this is not going to be an ethics talk. This is going to be a facts about health effects of climate change kind of talk. And anyone who's interested in philosophy and ethics will have to wait until literally the last slide when I will raise a kind of a, I'll leave you with a big philosophical provocation is what I'm calling it. And finally, I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare, so I could start the talk in chief. I've just turned on my timer in an effort to try to keep this at the right time, so we have plenty of time for discussion. Another preliminary matter, though. I want to tell you a little bit about why there's an environmental ethics talk coming from the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. The center was founded as a program almost 20 years ago. And at that time, I like to think of them as certain of the giants of bioethics were roaming around Yale. We had Jay Katz, who wrote The Silent World of Doctor and Patient, out at the law school. We had Jean Outka writing some really seminal stuff on healthcare justice at the Divinity School. Bob Levine, who has recently passed away, was one of the great founders of research ethics in the United States and indeed around the world. Margaret Farley and James Gustafson did moral theology and bioethics work. So it was a time at Yale when there was a great deal of wonderful bioethics related activity. But another one of the faculty founders of our center was this guy called Art Galston. And Art was a plant biologist at Yale. And he invented a weed killer, which was named Agent Orange. And much to Art's consternation, Yale, which owned the rights to Agent Orange because Art had invented it while he was here, gave it to the military. And the military sprayed it all over troops and foliage in Vietnam. And this led to a lot of personal injuries for the troops who were exposed to it, and also did tremendous amount of environmental damage to Vietnam. So when we were starting the bioethics program, Art was very concerned that it not be limited to only biomedical ethics. He wanted to make sure that it included elements around agricultural ethics, because that he was a kind of agricultural plant biologist. And also he wanted it to address environmental ethics. So from the very beginning, our bioethics center has been broad enough to include consideration of environmental ethics. And over the years, we've brought visitors here when we had funding for that from the Donahue Foundation and other places. We've had major environmental thinkers here like Holmes Ralston and Baird Collicott. And we continue to have affiliations with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, who are part of our core faculty here at the Bioethics Center, but who also teach environmental ethics and environmental kind of moral theology informed and sort of multicultural environmental ethics at the School of the Environment and at the Divinity School. All right, so that's the end of the background. Let me get to the talk in chief. I'm not going to waste any time with this audience persuading you that climate change is real. But just to give general background, this slide is just about major climate change effects that have impact on health. Obviously, higher temperatures in general, not dramatically higher temperatures, but in different pockets of the globe, dramatically higher temperatures. Rising ocean levels, desalinization of the ocean, which in turn affects ocean currents and also affects the kinds of life in the ocean, changes to air and water currents worldwide, and extreme weather events. These include heat waves, which we've been having more and more of, storms, including things like hurricanes and related flooding, and cold waves, the Arctic vortex kind of phenomenon. And finally, drought. In general, if you look around the entire globe, what we're finding is the dry areas of the globe are getting drier and the wet areas are getting wetter, because as the world heats up, moisture evaporates. And when it evaporates from wet areas, it falls again as rain. And when it evaporates from dry areas, it leaves those areas drier than before. So now getting to actual health effects. We can think about climate change as having three kinds of categories of health effects. First of all, they're the direct impact of the changes in the climate and in the weather. We're talking about direct impact on human health from heat, from cold, from drought, from rain, from flooding, right? All these things where it's the weather itself is affecting our health. Second, there are generally slightly longer term effects on health because of the way climate change affects natural systems. So we're thinking here of vector-borne diseases, like diseases spread by mosquitoes or ticks, waterborne diseases like bacteria and viral infections whose presence in the water is affected dramatically by climate change, and effects from changes in air quality as the climate changes. And here we're thinking about things like ground level ozone, excess ground level ozone, for example. Finally, and really importantly, climate change can affect human health because of its impact on human systems. Certain kinds of occupations are heavily impacted by climate change. Human nutrition and food security is affected by climate change. And even human mental health is affected by climate change. And these kinds of changes are generally mediated by human choices and human social organizations, which leads me next to comment on this issue of vulnerability. Which bits of the population are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? Vulnerability has lots of different determinants. First of all, of course, it matters where you are geographically. Populations on the coast are vulnerable to storm swell and flooding because of rising water levels. Rural populations can be vulnerable to food insecurity or can be made more vulnerable to general health effects because of the difficulty of transporting to them. It depends how vulnerable you are is partially dependent on how proximate you are to the vectors of vector-borne disease, right? So geographic location is a huge factor in determining how vulnerable a given population is to disease. Their current health status, of course, also matters, right? So heat waves or viral infections are much apt to cause death, for example, in people who have already underlying health difficulties and problems. So current health status isolates people who are more vulnerable. The state of the infrastructure, right? If you are in a country that has excellent water and sewage control and excellent drainage control and has available emergency facilities, organizations like the United States FEMA, who can help transport and house people in the wake of climate-related weather events, you're much less vulnerable than if you are in a place where the infrastructure for all of those things is terrible. Age and gender are big factors. Age, of course, things like heat waves and things like flooding tend to be more deadly to elderly people, and particularly to elderly people who are living in congregate settings like nursing homes. Gender is a little bit trickier. It seems as if men are more vulnerable to heat wave injuries because more men have outdoor occupations. But for example, flooding worldwide affects women more than men, because when floods arrive, there are a number of factors, but when floods arrive, women are apt to be at home, which means that they are less apt to get timely notification of the arrival of floods. And women are apt to be with children and with elders, so that when they flee, they are trying to flee with dependents, whereas men are apt to be at work alone, which means they are apt to get better prior notification, because workplaces are usually wired, easy to communicate with, and also they're fleeing on their own rather than with dependents. So women are more vulnerable to flooding all around the world. But strangely, in the United States, men have been more vulnerable to flooding. And this, again, has to do with occupational factors and the fact that we have generally better infrastructure, so certain kinds of male occupations are at greater risk. Socioeconomic status, of course, makes populations more vulnerable to climate events, because, for example, people of low socioeconomic status are apt to have inferior housing that may not be able to handle temperature changes as well, might not have air conditioning or heating. More crowded housing, which means that infectious disease might spread more easily. They are apt to be lower on the floodplain and more vulnerable to flooding. Lots of social factors that go with low socioeconomic status render low socioeconomic status populations vulnerable to the impacts of climate, as we'll see. And finally, population density and population growth are very important factors, obviously, because the more people are in the place where there's a climate impact, the more people's health will be affected by it. And an interesting factor here, and it's the first of many that we will see as I go through this talk, an interesting factor is that population growth is happening mostly in the global south and mostly in places that already have high levels of vulnerability to lots of kinds of climate impact. And so we see increasing risk to the people who are already most vulnerable for other reasons around the world. So in general, and I'll talk about this again later, in general, climate change is worst to the most vulnerable people. And those people are vulnerable not just to climate, but they tend to be people who are vulnerable to all kinds of ills across the board. They tend to have lower health status, they tend to have lower socioeconomic status, lower social status, all these kinds of things. Climate change, like pandemic, picks on the least well off. All right, so now let's start talking about this first class of climate change effects, the direct effects. The most prominent one is the effects of storm and flooding. And this is because storms and floodings are already the most common natural disasters. And of course, here, population location really matters. Coastal communities, communities along riversides are of course most vulnerable to this kind of climate change impact. And there are other indicia of vulnerability, like where on the floodplain your housing is located, and so on. Storm injury is actually incredibly complicated, and the effects of storms on health are very complicated and come in stages and can last for years. I already see that I'm missing one on this list. So first of all, when the storm is happening, when the flood is happening, we get drownings, we get electrocutions because of electricity and water not mixing well. We get trauma as people are hurled by floodwaters against things. We also get, or as structures collapse because of floodwaters, we also get evacuation injuries. People on evacuation routes are often rushing, and there can be crashes and stumbles and all kinds of bad health events. And then, having evacuated, people tend to be sheltered in crowded circumstances and often with poor plumbing, poor food and water supply. And so there's a sort of post-storm sheltering period when you get different kinds of health effects, like the spread of infectious disease or problems with inadequate food and water and so on, or inadequate heating in the wake of a storm. Related to that, storms often cause, and flooding often causes, power outages. And power outages have all kinds of health effects having to do with heating, having to do with the ability to cook. Some people are dependent on power for life support. And power outages have caused a tremendous difficulty, particularly in places like nursing homes, where a large number of people are dependent on technology that runs out of power eventually, like electric wheelchairs, and where the lack of air conditioning in the wake of a storm could really injure lots of very vulnerable people because of their pre-existing health conditions and their age. After storms, because storms typically overwhelm sewer systems and typically spread trash all around, you get outbreaks of waterborne disease. And as water begins to ebb and go away, you end up with mold coming into people's housing, and you get mold-related health disease. And then you get trauma and other kinds of injury from reconstruction in the wake of flooding and storms. And finally, you get quite long-term mental health impacts. There's been some very dramatic measures, for example, of the mental health impacts of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, showing very high percentages of the population of the city that was affected by the flooding having lingering mental health effects, including things like PTSD, for years after the flooding. And the thing that I realized that I've missed here, and I'm going to mention it again later, is in some cases, another effect on health after these storms is the effect of migration. We're seeing right now, for example, huge numbers of Hondurans trekking up from Honduras to the southern border of the United States, mostly because the infrastructure and the economy of Honduras was destroyed by a hurricane. And they are, and the very process of migrating raises all kinds of threats to health, including to mental health. So that's another kind of storm injury that we could think about. Think also about the number of people who migrated out of Puerto Rico after that hurricane. It's a pretty common large storm impact. More direct effects, heat waves. We know from the data that we are experiencing more frequent heat waves, and that it's projected that even in the very near future, we will have more frequent heat waves. Heat waves can, at some point, cause population displacement. There will be some areas that, under current projections, will be rendered uninhabitable by frequent heat waves that are impossible, that raise temperatures to levels that are impossible for humans to tolerate. So that will be a source of some health effects. It's very important when you're thinking about the health effects of heat waves to think about temperature variability. It turns out that people get used to hot weather. You're most vulnerable to heat if you have been used to cold. And your body takes, in general, most people take about 2 weeks to acclimate their bodily system to a warmer temperature. So the thing that is worst for people's health in terms of inducing heat stroke or heat exhaustion is a sudden onset of heat, particularly in areas that aren't used to hot weather. The elderly, of course, are disproportionately impacted, and so are people in low socioeconomic status who commonly live in more crowded housing and commonly don't have as good access to air conditioning. Outdoor laborers are also very big victims, health victims of things like heat stroke and heat exhaustion. We're thinking here about farmers and construction workers who are doing vigorous work out in the sun. Another profound effect on health can be the fact that heat yields increased levels of forest fires and other kinds of grass fires and so on. And both the fire itself can cause injury and death, and smoke from those fires can cause injury and death. On the other hand, there are going to be some small gains in terms of reduced morbidity and reduced mortality, because winters with climate change are going to become a bit more mild. But the data at the moment certainly show that the ill health effects of increased number of heat waves and higher temperatures more than outbalances whatever gains we might get from milder winters. Another direct effect of global warming and of climate change, surprisingly, is cold. And we're talking here about the polar vortex kind of cold snap that we've been having more and more frequently here in the United States. In fact, just recently in Texas, which very seldom experiences that kind of freezing temperatures. What's going on here is that the poles are warming. And when the poles warm, that reduces what had been a very sharp temperature variation between the middle belt of the planet and the ends. And that sharp variation had driven very strong wind patterns circulating around the Earth. And the strength of those patterns had isolated cold air at both poles. Now, as the poles are warming a bit, those wind patterns become less strong, and the borders, therefore, between the cold and the warm areas become a little bit more wobbly, and that permits cold polar air to move farther away from the poles, and you get these polar vortex phenomena like the one that caused some death and a lot of damage in Texas. And of course, the direct effects of cold can be death from exposure, power outages associated with freezing, injuries from ice, crop damage that can lead to food insecurity and poor nutrition, water damage, again, from freezing, pipes freezing and so on, and then subsequent mold and related illnesses. And again, population displacement. I want to say to Cancun, for example. All right. Another form of direct effect has to do with ocean current change. We have data that shows that ocean heat circulation, the global patterns of heat circulation, seem to be slowing. And this may have to do with desalinization of the ocean water, and it may have to do with the amount of heat that the ocean has absorbed during this during the last decades of climate change. But a result of this could be that the ocean currents that move mild temperature water up into the polar regions of the globe. So for example, the currents that keep Great Britain warmer than Russia, right? Because it's out in the ocean and warm water is circulating up from the south. Those currents may be slowing down. And if they slow down sufficiently, or indeed if they stop, that could result in climates being more directly related to where you are in terms of latitude. That is to say, the temperature in London could become a bit more like the temperature in, well, no, let's say the temperature in Edinburgh could become more like the temperature in Moscow, because they're just about equally far north, and the ocean would not be protecting Edinburgh as much anymore. On the other hand, as this is happening, we also expect global temperature on average to be rising. And so in the global north, the effects of this loss of circulation might be counterbalanced by the warmer overall temperatures of the Earth. So once again, we see a way in which the global north is a little bit advantaged by these natural phenomena. All right, so that is about the direct health effects of climate change. Now let's think about the effects that are mediated by various natural systems. And the first thing I'm going to talk about are a couple of vector-borne diseases. When we say vector-borne, we're talking about things like mosquitoes and ticks and other small biting animals. Malaria, of course, is a major cause of death worldwide. And without getting into huge amounts of detail, we have very persuasive data that shows that rising temperatures are associated with all these things you see on the slide. Faster development of mosquitoes, shorter intervals between the mosquitoes' need to suck human blood, faster developments of the parasite within the mosquito, longer duration of the seasons in which mosquitoes are active and can transmit malaria to humans. There's very good data that show that malaria is spreading to higher altitudes as those become less cold, and also that mosquitoes' range is expanding to higher latitudes, again, as global warming proceeds. However, there is a little bit of good news, which is that at very high temperatures, malaria can be eliminated. And this is because of insect desiccation and unfriendly environments for the species of mosquito that spread malaria. On the whole, warming looks like it might expand the range and human vulnerability to malaria. Another vector-borne disease that we're familiar with here in New Haven is Lyme disease, which is spread by ticks. I've given you here the kind of life cycle of the deer tick in question that spreads Lyme around here. They lay their eggs in the spring, and then at the larval stage, the larva takes one blood meal from small bird or small rodent. Then the tick acquires an infection that is in the small bird or the rodent, right? Ticks are not born with Lyme disease. They get it in that first blood meal, that first larval blood meal. Then they develop into a nymph and they go through the winter, and in the spring of the second year of the life of the tick, the nymph takes a blood meal, usually again on a rodent or on a slightly larger animal like a dog or a raccoon or a human. And this nymph bite is the most frequent source of human infection with Lyme disease. And then the following summer, the adult grows to full size and has another blood meal, and then winter's over and lays eggs in the following spring. So the ticks that carry Lyme disease basically have 3 blood meals in their entire 2-year lifespan. That's it. They acquire the infection with the first one, and they commonly spread it to humans in the second one. But this kind of complex pattern of life means that the climate has lots of different opportunities to affect the prevalence of Lyme disease. It can affect the distribution of ticks, and it can also affect the length of the season in which ticks are active. It can affect the availability of the tick's animal hosts, the rodents, the birds, the deer, that ticks live on in different phases of their lives. And it can affect, climate change can affect the proximity of us humans to the animal hosts, and therefore also to the ticks who might infect us. So if we migrate, or we change our farming patterns, or we change our outdoor recreation patterns in response to climate change, that can, of course, affect the amount of Lyme disease that humans will get. Very high temperature and very low humidity can kill ticks, and so can long periods of extreme cold. So there are ways in which climate change might actually reduce the amount of Lyme. Also, deforestation, which could be brought about by climate change, or an increase in the population of tick predators like possums, for example, or predators of the small rodents that ticks rely on. Those things can also affect the tick population. So the upshot is, it's super hard to disentangle the climate effects on all of these different elements and the human effects, the main human effects being that as we build new houses and increase our recreation in spaces where there are ticks, we get increased risk of disease. It's very hard to disentangle the human from the climate effects, but the general prediction is that the infection season and the lifespan of the ticks and the distribution of ticks will be changed in a way that will increase the frequency of Lyme disease. Waterborne diseases now. The big one we worry about here is cholera and other diseases, other related diseases. We know that higher temperature is associated with more instances of disease, and a big factor here, higher rainfall is also associated with it. Temperature and rainfall relate very much to sewage flooding and sewage control, and also animal waste runoff. So at higher temperatures, you get both more experience of disease and more of the kind of flooding that mixes waste that contains cholera and other related infectants, so that disease incidence goes up. Excuse me, I'm having a little choking problem. And of course, where your population is located is going to have a huge effect on the instance of disease. Other waterborne diseases are various viruses, the various causes of diarrhea, and we're not even really sure what many of those causes are, and bacteria associated with infections. These are all strongly associated with higher temperatures. The higher the temperature, the more instance of these disease. We've seen this dramatically in the Arctic, where the thawing of the permafrost has permitted more runoff of animal waste and of human waste, and has caused pollution in the water supplies of people in the Arctic, and again caused more of these bacterial and viral infections. Sewage control is always a big problem, and of course flooding can give rise to all of these diseases spreading more virulently. I don't have time now, but we also know that temperature is associated with increased rotavirus infections, and also with algal blooms that can poison water, or that can poison shellfish and fish in the water. So there are lots of water-based disease problems that will be on the increase given heat and given major storm events. Finally, we have air quality. Here, the data is not so good. The thought is that global climate change on the whole will reduce total levels of ozone in the atmosphere. But it is true that particularly in urban areas, because of the interactions with pollutants in the air, you do see in warm temperatures increases in ground level ozone, and even small increases in ground level ozone give rise to increases in heat wave mortality and other lung-related health problems. We also see, in terms of air quality and health problems and climate change, we see, of course, the acute air pollution that goes with fires. People suffering from smoke inhalation just from having lived in California during the massive forest fires, or in Australia during their massive forest fires last year. That is a serious climate change related health problem. Finally, now we get to the human kind of institution mediated health effects. I'm looking to my timer to make sure I'm not going to overshoot. Food insecurity is a major climate change health issue, right? Poor nutrition. This can be brought about by food and drought that affects crops, and that in turn can raise prices of food. And simply high prices resulting from climate change can, of course, hurt the least well off. Once again, we see a situation in which, in part due to the way we subsidize our agriculture in the global north, we see the global south losing out if climate change causes higher food prices, because most of the globe's poorest countries are in the global south. The threat of flood and drought to the food supply is to some extent balanced by the fact that we will have longer growing seasons in the global north. So that's good for the world food supply, but again, it reinforces this difference in vulnerability between the global north and the global south. I mentioned already occupational health, where we see heat strain and heat exhaustion and heat stroke in people who are outdoor workers, agricultural workers, construction workers. There are maps of where the largest populations of outdoor workers are most vulnerable to these heat-related illnesses, and they are predominantly in the global south. The real hotspots are in the western kind of hump of Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula and in India. Slightly less bad, but still pretty bad, are the hot regions in the northern part of Australia and the regions right around the Gulf Coast of the United States and Mexico. But again, most of the most dangerous places for occupational health are in the developing world. Global climate change can, and indeed has, given rise to violence. Poverty and food shortages and poor governments and poor infrastructure can lead to protest and violence, and poverty and poor governance are associated with and caused by various kinds of climate impacts. So we expect some violence to result from a heated globe. And we also need to note the inverse, which is that populations who've already been affected by violence, where people are already displaced or living in refugee camps or have their supply chains disrupted by violence, are that much more vulnerable to climate change health impacts. For example, if a storm were to come along or a heat wave were to come along. And another really important source of difficult health effects is mass migration that's driven by climate change. Mass migration can be triggered by violence itself, but of course by flooding, particularly repeated flooding, and drought, and storms. And we've seen some pretty dramatic examples of this. There's a pretty decent theory that the Syrian civil war was brought about by crop shortages that were related to a period of Syrian drought that caused a lot of civil unrest and eventually triggered the internal war. And that created this huge exodus of people to North Africa and across the Mediterranean into Southern Europe. And that in turn, that wave of migration in turn has given rise to sort of nationalist right-wing politics in lots of European states. So the mass migration that seems to have been brought about by a climate-related problem has had absolutely dramatic effects on world politics and, of course, on health. The health of refugees in close quarters in camps, all this kind of thing, profoundly affected by the Syrian civil war. And I mentioned already, right now we're experiencing this big exodus from Honduras in the wake of the hurricane that basically destroyed the economy. And the health effects of mass migration are myriad. Those who are migrating have a hard time getting adequate nutrition. There are big mental health impacts. I mentioned before crowded refugee camp conditions, which lead to more infectious illness and more vector-borne illness because of, for example, rodents in the camps. And also, I should say, waterborne illness too, because of poor sewage and infrastructure in refugee camps, and also violence. So I've mentioned mental health a few times, but I wanted to give it its own slide because it's often neglected in discussions of health effects of climate change. We have really good evidence of short-term distress that's associated with specific climate events. There's really good post-Katrina data showing people with PTSD and anxiety and depression in the wake of that storm. And we also know that longer-term problems like repeated drought that destroys crops and so on can lead to chronic stress and can raise suicide rates over time. So now that's the end of my parade of data. And I'm going to give you just a few observations in the slightly less than 3 minutes I have left in my 45 minutes. I see Lori's come back on live because she's going to warn me to stop, but I've got my timer on. All right. Like pandemic, climate change tends to hurt the least well off, and it also tends to point out to you who they are. And this is exacerbated by natural north-south differentiations in climate effects, and some unnatural north-south differentiations in terms of, I already mentioned, in terms of the way we trade food and the effects of colonization and monoculture farming and so on. Lots of historical effects make the South, the global South, more vulnerable to climate change. But there are some natural effects as well, just in terms of where the heat is located and where the storms are located and where large populations are coastal and where the floodplains of the world's great rivers are and so on. The health effects can't be debated. They're already happening, and we know that they will be increasing. And adaptations to try to stop those health effects from being worse need to happen at every level, from the smallest gesture, like putting a canopy out in the field so that people who are picking crops can rest in the shade and get a drink of water, to things like a city needing to redesign its subway system, or needing to redesign its sewage system, or needing to bury its electric wires so that storms don't cause as many power outages, right? Those kinds of local or national infrastructural considerations will have to be put into play. And then, of course, we have these global questions about immigration. If there's mass migration, we have to think about how to take care of those people, and about global and regional trade policies, particularly around food and around rescue supplies and so on. Mitigation of climate change is also absolutely necessary. Even if we were to convert entirely now to renewable energy and were to stop contributing to climate change today, which we're not anywhere near close to doing, these health effects would be expected to continue to grow for decades and get worse and worse. So we need not only to adjust to these health effects, but we need to mitigate climate change in many different ways. It is true, however, that this threat to human health of climate change is a useful prod to action, and it may be what was necessary to get us to actually do something about climate change, which of course impacts not just humans, but all species. Here's my final philosophical provocation, and then I'll let Lori address questions to me that have come up in the chat or in the Q&A. I think the threat to human health of climate change is bad for environmental ethics. And here's why I think that. Back when environmental ethics started being a thing, in the early 1970s, Aldo Leopold was before that, but when environmental ethics became an academic field in the early 70s, people noticed that our ordinary ethical theories were a little bit too anthropocentric and short-term and about very transactional and so on, and that it did not apply, none of our ordinary moral theories applied comfortably to considerations about the value of the environment or the value of abstract entities such as species or of ecosystems. And so environmental ethics turned toward thinking about values and confrontations with values in nature and the value in itself of the land. Here it's Aldo Leopold was early, but then you had many other contributors to this kind of environmental philosophy. But now, under the pressure of these very real health threats because of climate change, we are seeing a return to anthropocentric short-term local thinking. And I feel that the environmental ethic, the distinctly environmental ethic that many people were calling for in the 1970s, is actually the right way to do ethics generally. I think ethics between human beings should be about apt attitudes toward values that we confront in the course of living our lives, multiple values whose worth can't be sorted by a theory. I have a long view about how ethics should work, and I'm afraid that the exigency of this health crisis right now is going to throw off ethical thinking, not only in the environmental area, but more generally for quite some time. So now, over to you all. We've got not quite 45 minutes more for discussion, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. Lori, do you want to feed questions to me?
I will. Thank you, Steve, for this illuminating talk. Sorry?
I'm going to unshare too.
Oh, perfect. Okay, that's great. Thank you for your illuminating talk. I certainly learned a lot. I want to start with a question that asks, are these facts that you presented indisputable?
Indisputable, I would say no. The authoritative source for these facts, you know what I didn't do? I'm sorry, I didn't show you my slides with citations. When I got to the end of the talk, I forgot to go on to show you my sources, but I do have source slides. And the really great source here is the fifth Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment report has a chapter in it, chapter 11, which is on human health effects. And all of these health effects in this report are marked with different kinds of confidence levels. So for example, it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on with climate change and dengue, right? There's just not really good data. Malaria, there is a fairly large amount of confidence about the things that I said about malaria. Increased storm activity, there's definitely a large amount of confidence around that. But all of these things are data-driven, and all projections from data can be disputed. So I wouldn't say that these things are indisputable, but I would say that they're based on the best available data and are thought to be true by a large consensus of scientists worldwide.
Thank you. That's very helpful. There was a question about values and how might values influence our response to climate change. So it was rather open-ended, and perhaps you might want to use an example, or perhaps you might want to hypothesize of your own accord.
Okay. Let me, a major brand name of ethical theory is consequentialism. Consequentialism is the brand of ethical theory that says that your actions, the morality of your actions, should be measured by the consequences that your actions bring about. A paradigm case of that is utilitarianism. And what utilitarianism is saying is there's basically one kind of value, and that's pleasure. And there's disvalue, which is pain. It's the absence of, or the opposite of that value. And the variety of consequentialism that utilitarianism says, let's maximize the one value in the world that there is, which is pleasure. So our actions are more moral to the extent that their impact is to increase the amount of pleasure, and they're less moral to the extent that they cause pain or decrease pleasure. But you can have consequentialisms with lots of different kinds of value. So for example, a famous turn of the century philosopher had a consequentialism where he said the really valuable things in life are beauty and friendship. And so an action that was that increased the amount of beauty and friendship in the world was a moral one, and an action that decreased it was an immoral one. And Aldo Leopold, a famous environmentalist and Yale alum, had this idea of a land ethic in which he thought that the primary value of a conservationist should be whether something is good for the land, right? Another way you can use values, though, rather than embedding them in a theory and saying, here are my values, let's maximize these, or let's spread these around, is to think to yourself, there are lots of different kinds of values. There could be beauty, there could be pleasure, there could be elegance, there could be, you know, any number of things that we could value. Health, species diversity, right? Any number of things that we could value. And there might not be one single coherent theory that holds them all together or ranks them or tells us which things we should be maximizing or whatever. Instead, we might simply have to debate with one another in terms of those values about what it would be best, all things considered, to do. There's no particular reason to think that there's a currency that allows us to trade off full food supply against extinction of a particular snail species, right? The snail species has a certain kind of value and food supply has another kind of value, and we can debate about how we ought to prioritize those things here and now, right? So I feel like, and of course, to human beings, health is a profound baseline value. If you're not healthy, there's a lot of other stuff that you can't do and a lot of other values you can't pursue. So that's my kind of overview of how values would come into thinking about environmental ethics and about these health impacts in particular. I'll say one more thing, which is that there's a philosopher I quite like, Nikolai Hartmann, who has this idea that there are that values come in hierarchies, and that there are low, strong values, like in architecture. There's the bedrock, and then there's higher, weaker values that are delightful decoration, right? Low, strong values, say in politics, are like order or democratic legitimacy. And for human beings, there are things like health or situation in human relationships, really things that we value that are really basic to us. And then there are higher, weaker values that we can achieve, like artistic achievements or scientific innovation, right? The environment, I think, has certain kinds of low, strong values and higher, weak values too. So that the preservation of ecosystems as a whole might be a really important low, strong value, and the fate of a particular species might not be so central to our thinking.
There are some questions about how to kind of pick and choose, and which of these many priorities ought to be tackled and how, and questions about how to kind of inspire cross-pollination. And I can imagine that that must be a rather global effort. And so I'd love for you to kind of comment on prioritization and cross-pollination.
Part of the answer, I think, is you have to do what you can where you are. I, as an academic in New Haven, Connecticut, can't do much directly to address mass migration, right? Joe Biden can, but I can, for example, try to make sure that our mayor has cooled spaces and water available to the elderly and to people in the poorest housing in my city in the event of heat waves, right? There can be health-related adaptations to climate change right in your neighborhood. And then there are other kinds of adaptations to climate change to save health that require whole great political systems to work, and indeed global political systems to work. So we kind of have to do everything at once. This is an emergency. I mean, it's the emergency. Not just in terms of human health, but in terms of vanishing species and radical changes to the planet that threaten the survival of many species, including our own, right? There is a ton of stuff that needs to be done, and it all needs to be done at once. Adaptation, mitigation, but it can be done at a lot of different levels, and it can be done even by individuals at the local level. I hope that's an answer to the question.
Thank you. Thank you. And kind of sort of building on that, do you think that climate change may shift our ideas of rights? Here in the US, we have this rather unique take on rights. Do you think that climate change may help to shift any of that, whether it's the right to bees, or the right to have our species be kept, animal species that are local to us be kept safe, or perhaps even an increased push for declaring health as a human right here in the US, which has never happened.
I hope that the massive threat of climate change will increase solidarity, not only within the United States, but globally. Everybody now, I mean, there are people out there still who deny the existence of climate change or deny the existence of anthropomorphic climate change, human-caused climate change, but anthropogenic, I should have said, climate change. But more and more people are feeling these health effects of climate change, and more localities are realizing that they have to start funding adaptations now, because you know what, the New York subway system is going to fill up with water, and you know, it can't be avoided. And so I'm hoping that in the same way that we can't avoid the impacts of climate change and we can't avoid the health impacts of climate change, we will be jammed by that into a position of needing to think of ourselves as jointly vulnerable and as needing each other to save us all. I hope that's true.
I hope that's true too. In our May 5th session, we will be talking more about the response, but folks are very eager to hear from you about some kind of response, whether it's primarily from the medical profession, but also the individual clinician. And I know you'll be going into that in much more detail then, but if you could kind of perhaps give a teaser to your May 5th talk and just address a bit about beyond sounding the alarm and leveraging trust to advocate for mitigation and adaptation agendas, how can the medical profession and what can they do? Or what ought they do?
Yeah. A couple of things. I mean, most of what we need to do to improve health here as across the board is a matter of social institutional change rather than a matter of, you know, clinical intervention, right? Most of what we need to do is make the sewers better, improve the living situation of our most vulnerable so that they aren't vulnerable to heat or to flooding, right? It's social, large-scale social change is most of what we need, both in the United States and around the world. And that's not something that clinicians have a unique role in. They have the same role that other citizens have. But their professional status as clinicians lets them do a couple of things that I'll try to comment on. One is they should anticipate increased needs for their clinical services that will be driven by these events. So there should be more training about the cycle of kinds of injuries and health threats that come with flooding, for example, so that physicians in the field will be able to anticipate the different kinds of waves of health problems that are going to arrive in their offices or in the emergency department. They should keep track of data. it will be powerful and very useful if physicians in the ED, for example, can gather the data and tell the stories of who comes into the ED during a heat wave, or who comes into the ED after a really major thunderstorm that came with a couple of tornadoes, right? You know, you hear stories about injuries when houses collapse or when things flood. You see videos of the wreckage, but you almost never hear the medical story, right? So I think physicians telling their stories and gathering the data about the way they experience the health impacts of these events is going to be really important for lobbying for the social interventions that we need to try to reduce the health impacts of climate change. So yeah, training, anticipation, data gathering, publicity, and through their institutional bodies, state medical societies, for example, could have a lot to say to state public health officials about the need to plan in advance for emergency health services that are related to very predictable increased instances of climate change driven health disasters.
Thank you. There are questions about systemic change and so forth. Let's see here. Could you say a little bit more as to how you see this current pandemic health crisis, itself also likely linked to environmental issues, has perhaps thrown off ethical thinking, as you mentioned at the end of your talk? And this is from our dear seminar leader, Sue Cobb.
Thanks, Sue. Let's see. First of all, it's quite possible that this pandemic was brought about by some impact of climate change. I mean, one thing that can be associated with climate change is shifts in locations of populations. And when populations move into closer proximity with various wild creatures, there are more apt to be more diseases that jump between those creatures, like bats, for example, and human beings. And some of that can be climate change driven. Some of it is just driven by things like population explosions and so on. But leaving that aside, one thing that pandemic has in common with climate change, as I've mentioned, is that it strikes the most vulnerable people the hardest. Everybody who is already systemically disadvantaged is more disadvantaged when these crises come along. We see that with our attention to structural racism now in the United States. There's been a huge wave of debate and a huge wave of academic thought and thought in bioethics relating to structural racism and more broadly to structural injustice, and how that is a determinant of the impact of the pandemic on people. I don't think, well, I actually feel like ethical thought connected to the pandemic there's been a bit of an improvement. I think we are actually thinking more broadly about wealth differentials and thinking more broadly about structures, social structures, and their impact on health. And I think that's a good thing. So I guess I kind of don't agree with the premise of Sue's question, which is she was looking for a parallel in the pandemic world to what I claimed was a problem with ethical thought around climate change, and I don't see the same parallel.
Thank you. There are some questions, as mentioned, about systemic change, and one of our participants asked whether it's possible to find a balance between proposing systemic changes to mitigate and eventually eradicate policies harmful to the environment, while also balancing the harms that may be caused to industries and jobs that many vulnerable people certainly rely upon today. So how do we balance these needs for ensuring that our most vulnerable are not further impacted by job losses when we're trying to protect the environment?
Yeah. A couple of things. One is that the right kind of structural responses to climate change might actually create new job opportunities, and might and there are, and I'll be talking about this next time, there are immediate health benefits, for example, that would flow from some kinds of mitigation, quite apart from the long-term change in the climate. A shift from coal to solar will greatly enhance lung health in the United States. It just will, really fast, really fast. Quite apart from whatever effect it has on the climate, right? So there are sort of co-benefits of mitigation in health. But I'm afraid that that this nature of this crisis and the small amount of time that we have to fix it will mean that there are going to be losers, particularly people who work in the industries that contribute the most to greenhouse gas production. And I think that the right way to handle that is through the expansion of government support programs for those people. Unemployment benefits, retraining programs, those kinds of things. I don't think I'd rather take care of the people directly than try to take care of them by leaving the harm-causing systems in place for a little while. I don't think we have time for that.
Thank you. There are some questions in the chat related to this urgency and how we may perhaps have just a decade to keep the temperature rise less than 2 or more degrees Celsius. One attendee said that these justice movements, of course, can take decades, and that dovetails into what others are saying about this need for solidarity in a country where we're not really used to talking about solidarity. We're used to talking about our individual rights. So perhaps you could comment upon this challenge we have before us of helping to kind of promote this idea of solidarity, which may perhaps be a new thing in some ways. I mean, I'm sure in our history, we can certainly look to a number of wonderful times where we did come together, but it doesn't seem like we're necessarily doing that so well right now. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on those points.
No, we're really not doing that well. And you know, my colleague at the law school here at Yale, Dan Kahan, has done some work about how people with different beliefs around climate change or around vaccination, for example, entrench themselves more deeply in their thought and are open only to confirmation of what they already think, and the politicization of these things. And he has some concrete advice about how to talk about climate change, for example, which is basically don't. Instead, talk about the fact that ocean levels are rising and we're going to need to do something about that. Or talk about the fact that, boy, every time a storm comes through, it seems like people in this neighborhood suffer disproportionately. What can we do about that, right? So you can talk about climate change effects, and that gets you around the hard division that's associated with the language of climate change. And the same thing can be true in other places where people have polarized. But listen, I don't expect the United States to be a world leader in this area. We need to do a lot. We need to convert our energy sources and so on. But I do think we're highly polarized, and I do think we are culturally short on solidarity. So I kind of expect much of the rest of the world to do more of the job of saving the earth than the United States will. I'm waiting. I'm fearfully awaiting the climate-driven catastrophe that would unify America. I don't know what that would be. I don't know what it would be. Something sufficiently disastrous to make us all say, wow, we need each other to get past this. It's hard to imagine.
I think we have time for just one final question. And after you answer that, if there are any final closing remarks you'd like to make, I would welcome you to do so at that time. There have been some questions about potential justice issues associated with industrialized nations who, as we know, may contribute more CO2 emissions than others, and what perhaps might that mean in terms of our obligations to asylum seekers and others who may be vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, the global north, as I keep calling it, the developed world, obviously has contributed and continues to contribute much more than its share of greenhouse gases. This problem was created by the industrialized world. Today, the developing world is a greater and greater source of greenhouse gases, but we may be able to head off the massive use of those sources of power because we're having some scientific breakthroughs in terms of clean energy sources, and particularly if we get better at batteries, and everybody in the world is working on batteries right now. If we get better at batteries, we might be able to help the developing world skip over and the dirtiest phase of their development and reduce the current levels of pollution. But the grave injustice here is obvious and is amplified by features of the natural earth. As I've said before, not only did the industrialized North contribute most to this problem, but we're going to be hurt least by it. We're the ones who have the least vulnerability to vector-borne disease. We're the ones who are going to get milder winters rather than temperatures that will drive people away from the arid land, right? So we're getting natural, we're much less threatened that by global warming than the developing world is. And we have this whole history of governmental and economic colonialism and international trade policy and stuff that has worsened the conditions of people in the developing world. So yeah, we owe, I think, here, you know, Thomas Pogge, my colleague at the philosophy department at Yale, he's been under fire for sort of Me Too issues. But he writes about how global justice is not a matter of distributional justice, but of compensatory justice, because the economic situation of the developing world was really caused by the developed world, and continues to be caused by the developed world. So his view is we owe compensation to the developing world. And one way to compensate is to accept the people who flee the natural disasters that are in fact being caused by our long-term polluting behaviors. And another way is to redistribute resources globally, healthcare resources included, medicines for all of these diseases that follow climate change-driven crises. So yeah, I really do think that there is a global justice program that's associated not only with the developed world's blame for climate change, but it's blame for all of these global social factors that make climate change impact even worse in the developing world.
Thank you so much for that. It is getting close to our time where we need to say goodbye to you all. I want to remind you all that if you'd like to receive further communications about our policy events, you are most welcome to join us, and I encourage you to go to our website at bioethics.yale.edu, and under programs you can find our policy program, and you can sign up for our newsletters. As mentioned, on May 5th will be our next talk, and after that we'll have lots of bioethics events in our summer program, including a 3-week seminar on ethics of climate change by Dr. Latham. And so, as I mentioned in the chat, if you are an alum of the summer program, you don't need to reapply. If you'd like to come back for one or a few seminars, you can just email us at bioethics@yale.edu to request space if there is space. And also, of course, if you are interested in the summer program and have not attended yet, you are welcome to visit our website, send me an email. We're happy to discuss it. But with that, I believe our time is pretty much up for the day. So I hope to see you again on May 5th or in the near future. And Steve, this was tremendous and terrific, and I am truly grateful to you for sharing all of this with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank everybody for coming. And I'm sorry I didn't get to answer everyone's questions, but I hope you got something out of the talk and the discussion. See you again soon, I hope.